a little hello to everyone over here. My name is Michael Zammit Maempel, and I'm a lawyer working and practicing here in Malta. I've been around for the kind of years that I actually have to calculate now. So I graduated sometime around 2001, so that makes about 19 years now. These days I work mostly in intellectual property, in data protection, and in tech law. But I spent a good 16 years of my life going to court every day in Malta and handling lots of tort cases and a few free expression cases as well. What's the scope of today's session? I was asked to come here and explain how lawyers tackle an argument, how lawyers tackle a debate. It's our bread and butter, it's what we do every day, whether you go to court or whether you're negotiating a contract or whether you're simply tackling a legal problem on your own. You're creating a debate in your head. You have to analyze facts by going through the process of debate. So what I plan to do with you people over here today is I want to show you the way it works, at least from a Maltese perspective. The Maltese perspective is not unique. It's common to a lot of other jurisdictions throughout the world, common to a lot of Commonwealth jurisdictions and also a lot of continental civil law jurisdictions in Europe at least. But there obviously will be different systems around the world. So what I want to do is I want to show you a little history of how the art of debate developed in the legal world. And then we'll analyze how we actually tackle debate in the legal world and give you a few pointers on how you can use some of the tricks, some of the skills that we use in law, and how you can take them to other forms of debate where you can apply them and make them a success for your own debate. So let me just share my screen. I have a little presentation prepared. There you go. So just give me a moment, a little bit of a technical issue over here. Nick, for some reason, it's not recognizing my presentation. One moment. Let's try again. We test ran it before and it worked perfectly, but obviously when there's an audience, it won't work because that's the rule. Okay, here it is. Good. So I'll do that. I trust you can all see it, yes? Cool. So let me run through this. As I said, I want to run you through a little bit of history to put this in a bit of context, but legal debate is not something new. Lawyers haven't started arguing in 2020. They've been around for a few thousand years, ever since civilization came into being and any form of law and order was established. The picture you see over there is taken from ancient Egypt, where they would decide cases on a basis of majority, and the little slots you see over there used to be filled with chips, with little tiles, and on the basis of who taught, they take majority voting on an issue and decide issues that way. It doesn't mean majorities can't be wrong, and this is why systems have evolved and we've moved into systems that are more reliable than simple majority voting. But what I mean to tell you is that some form of legal system, some form of concluding legal debates and coming out with a conclusion has existed in all the known civilizations around the world, whether it's ancient China, whether it's ancient Egypt, Greece. It was perhaps perfected by the Romans. Let's move on a bit. So in tandem with the development of law, the legal profession has developed with it. So, law hasn't developed in a vacuum. The people working with the law, lawyers primarily, and judges, the judiciary, have developed in tandem with the development of law. And just as the profession has evolved, so did its fundamental tool, which is obviously the art of debate. Let's look a little bit more closely at how debate came about. So, in most legal systems, especially I can talk about the Maltese system, but I know this is common to other systems. So it's influenced heavily by ancient Greek and Roman culture. Now, in ancient Greek and Roman culture, there were two schools of thought, and one of them was the sophists. Who were the sophists? The sophists felt that an argument was successful if you could convince people by its forcefulness. So it involved a certain element of theatrics. It meant, you know, a lot of posturing. It meant a lot of delivery and sounding grand. They felt that the more you could convince someone through making an argument look good, sound good, and feel good, then that led to your instinct saying, yes, this is the correct way to go. Along came Aristotle, and he taught things a little bit differently. And what he did is that he took the principles of mathematics and he decided to apply them to debate. And that's where, you know, the theories of logic came around. Some of you may have studied this at high school when you were around, and the basic principles of logic. You know, if this is not this and something else is not this, and then, you know, you start making parallel logical sequences between them. So Aristotle's recipe has survived to this day, and certainly the Maltese system and a lot of systems in the Commonwealth and within Europe are based on this. His works on logic were put together in his key work, which is called the Organon, where all these principles were explained. What is Aristotle's logic all about? This is important because it doesn't just govern a law debate, it governs any sort of debate. But Aristotle's logic can be summed up in one word, which is deduction. What can you deduce from a set of facts, from a set of circumstances? And the way you come up with this is that you have initially a number of premises, a number of givens, a number of facts, a number of conclusions that are put on the table, and they are presented. Once you have these items on the table, you then come up with assertions, affirmations, contradictions, and denials. You basically test the facts that you have on the table, okay? Does this stand up to every form of, you know, if I have this stone in front of me, if I look at it from every way, does it still look like a phone, or does it look like different things from different angles? So in the same way, you'd have a fact, you look at it from different angles, and you put it through different tests to make sure that it stands and it's solid. Once you've gone through this process, you can then come up with the process of deduction, okay? That produces knowledge, that is a demonstration. Again, those of you who go back to your years of mathematics when you were doing theorems in your geometry, you know, you always came up with the demonstration at the end. You proved something on the basis of a number of facts, and you came up with a demonstration. And it's the same principle that applies to legal debates. We still follow the same order that I've listed for you over there. Facts, affirmations, contradictions, and then you have a demonstration to it. How does this work in reality? Incidentally, the picture you see over there is Malta's criminal court, which is where the grand juries are held. It's a rather cold room, which was intentionally designed that way to inspire a little bit of fear in the accused whenever they were brought in front of it. It's not my favorite room in the courtroom, but hey, there you go. Let's talk about legal arguments in Malta, but you can take this to your own jurisdictions and your own experiences. So the Maltese court system is heavily Aristotelian insofar as making arguments is concerned. And court cases, at least in Malta, but again, you can apply this to your own jurisdiction, are typically divided into three sections. So you have the initial part, which is where the principal claim or the accusation is laid out. So Giselle, I'm going to pick on her because I'm saying her over there. So Giselle is accused of having robbed a bank, or having murdered someone, or having run over someone in the road. She's a terrible person. No, I'm joking, obviously. But that would be the main accusation, the main statement which you are out to prove. The second part would be the evidence hearing bit, so the fact finding. In support of that statement, whether Giselle robbed the bank or didn't rob a bank, what sort of evidence do we have one way or another that can prove it, that can back up the claim and make it consistent or inconsistent? The third part would be the concluding part, which is where we look at all the arguments that we have on the table and we come up with, as we said before, the demonstration. The process of deduction leads to a demonstration. let's take each of these sections and explain how we carry out the debate in each of these parts. So the claim or the accusation. So what happens in this phase is that we have the basic premise of the case, and these are set out always in writing. Writing is important because we still have a tradition where once it's set in writing, it can't really be altered. Whereas you can quickly alter what you've just said 5 minutes ago and add something to it or give it a bit of nuance. Obviously, when you're talking about written claims, it's very difficult to say, okay, I'm going to change this. So the usual premise is once you have made a claim, you cannot really go back and change it. You can maybe make a little correction if there was a spelling mistake. But the basic premises are set out in writing and have to hold for the rest of the case. The language you use in that statement needs to be neutral, and you cannot attempt to sway the opinion of the court at that point. So you have to rely strictly on what is factual. And I'll show you an example of this in a minute. But once you draw it up and present it, it cannot be changed. Otherwise, you keep shifting the goalposts, okay? So if I've accused you of going out to rob a bank on the 16th March at 4 p.m., I can't suddenly realize, but it may have been 8 p.m., okay? So once you've set out the accusation, that remains as it is. I made the point about the language being neutral. And the next slide I want to show you is a headline from a Maltese newspaper only from last January. You may or may not have heard about the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia that took place here in Malta. And it's one of the, I think, the most high-profile trials we've had going on in Malta in the last 50 years. And one of the points that came up, and there was a whole procedural issue about it, was the fact that there was a boat involved to detonate the bomb. And the state prosecutor used the word yacht instead of using the word boat. And the defense objected to that because it said the fact that you are implying it is a yacht, you are implying that it is a high value item, you are implying that there is an element of luxury involved. If it's a boat, call it a boat, is what the defense lawyer said. Was he right? Was he wrong? It's not something I'm going to get into. But the point I'm making over here is that, yes, sometimes little words, and again, you can think of this in your debate, just granding a word up, from a boat calling it a yacht, or from a yacht calling it a ship, or from a ship calling it a cruise liner, even though we're still talking about something that ultimately floats on water, the choice of words we use for something can have a huge bearing on the unspoken part of the debate. Okay, like I said, if I say someone's using a yacht, it probably means I'm not talking about someone, we're not talking about an ordinary fisherman who's just going out to catch a few fish. We're talking about an element of luxury, we're talking about an element of money over there. So it can have a bearing. The next stage would be the fact-finding part. Okay, so this is the most interesting part of a court case, and it's usually the part that takes longest. Now, in court, it's what we call the law of evidence. How do we bring evidence forward? Now, evidence can be one of two forms. It can either be in the form of a document. Okay, so if I want to prove that I've paid for something, I will produce a receipt of something, or someone left a statement of perhaps a will, a last will or succession. That would be a document you'd present it in court. But largely, it's to do with witnesses, and lawyers need to develop quite a skill in court in having arguments. Sometimes aren't really allowed, but sometimes you find yourself arguing with a witness and having a debate with that witness because you need to get information out of that witness. I'm going to go back to documents. Remember, documents doesn't just mean paper. I mentioned before that I deal with intellectual property, and it's not the first time that I instead of filing an actual document, I have to go to court and exhibit a bottle. Why? Because we're talking about bottles with a similar shape. I remember one of the ones we had at the office some time ago was a bottle of Love soap and a bottle of Dove soap. So, to show the similarity of it, we had to present both bottles. So we went along to court, with these plastic bottles and had to deposit them. And the registrar just looked at us and said, do I stamp these or not? We're like, do what you want, just put them in a plastic bag if need be. Okay, so documents doesn't just mean a piece of paper. It can also mean a revolver. Okay, so technically a revolver, if it's being used as a means to commit a murder, we would still refer to that as a document. So don't just think in terms of paper or what comes out of your printer. A document can have a wider meaning than that. Okay, so like we said, documents or witnesses are both forms of evidence. And here's the interesting bit. So there are rules on how we conduct a debate in court, on how we ask questions. And the way you ask the question is often more important than the question itself. And I'll give you an example. So we have two forms of ways in which you can ask questions. One of them is called the examination in chief. Okay, what is an examination in chief? It's basically when I summon a witness in my defense. So I've summoned Giselle or Nicole to give evidence on this subject. When they are my witness, I cannot put leading questions to them. What does this mean? So let's say I wanted to establish a fact from Nicole. I can't ask Nicole a question and say, Nicole, were you at home asleep at 8 o'clock last Saturday? Because her only way of answering that question is by saying yes or no. So I've created the answer in the question itself, and I've led her. If I wanted to know where Nicole was last Saturday, I would have to ask her the question in a reverse way. Nicole, where were you on Saturday? And she would then give me the reply to that. The difference between the two questions is that a direct question has a lot more power. It's like answering a multiple choice question. If I just go on for 15 minutes telling Nicole, so Nicole, were you at home, fast asleep, in bed at 8 o'clock last Saturday? And she'd say yes. And was your mother watching and made sure you had actually gone into your room? Yes. And were your keys locked away in the drawer somewhere? You know, I've created the story myself, and she's just passively said yes or no. And we haven't really got much information out of Nicole. I've created all the information and I've just asked her to correct it. So you need to ask the questions in the opposite way. When it comes to a cross-examination, you can make these leading or direct questions. So you can corner a witness only when you are the defense. Okay, so to take this back again, let's imagine I summoned Nick as a witness in favor of my case. That means I can only carry out an examination in chief. Well, the lawyer on the other side of the room is going to carry out the cross-examination. And that is where you can make these leading or direct questions. It's more powerful because you want to corner the witness and find out whether they've been lying or being a little bit too generous with the truth. So that is where you put them in a little corner and you can make sure that they are answering and being truthful. In a cross-examination, you cannot bring up new issues, so you have to depend on what's being carried out in the examination in chief. You can't simply come up with something new. So that's the penance you get for being able to ask direct questions. It's counterbalanced in that way. Okay? But that's the main form of dialogue that we have in court when we are questioning witnesses. The examination in chief and the cross-examination. So it usually goes in turns. First the examination in chief and then the cross-examination. It's often tricky in a criminal law situation where usually you have to be rather quick in carrying out your cross-examination on the spot. You know, a witness has just given evidence 5 minutes ago and you need to come in with your questions on the spot. So you really need to have a quick capacity for absorbing what you've heard and turning the information around in your head so that you can come back with a question. And this, again, may have bearing for you guys when you come for live debates. Never underestimate the importance of listening to the arguments and the direction that your opponent is taking and to absorb from it on the spot. Don't simply come in with something that you've prepared last week because it may not necessarily be relevant. Sometimes you need to adapt and you need to be quick to adapt depending on what has just happened 5 minutes ago. It's not an easy skill. I mean, I see lawyers who have just come to court for the first time in their life. And, you know, you really feel sorry for them because they're really struggling to be quick on yourself. And again, I won't say that I'm a master at it, even after 20 years of doing it. Sometimes thinking on the spot and coming up and having enough quickness, enough speed to come up with the right question at the right time sometimes requires a huge amount of effort and skill. So, examination in chief and cross-examination. The other rules that we have, again, I'm taking these from Maltese procedure, but they exist in a lot of other systems. So witnesses can only state what they know at first hand. They cannot make assumptions. So I'll give you an example about this. While I'm giving this presentation to you, I'm assuming that the green box in that corner of the room is still there. But until I actually look at it and confirm that it's there, I can't give evidence about it. And that makes all the difference. So make a distinction in your mind, and especially when the other person is speaking, on whether they are saying something because they actually know it, because they've actually experienced it, they've actually seen it, they've heard it, they felt it, or whether they're relying on something they've concluded. I haven't heard a crash in this room, so I'm going to assume that the wall behind me hasn't crashed. But again, until I actually look at it, I can't confirm it. These are weaknesses that you can spot in your opponent's arguments and which you can use to your advantage. If someone is making assumptions, someone's just making rubbish arguments just on the basis of what they feel is correct, you can really poke a lot of holes in that. And the minute you've poked a lot of holes in someone else's argument, you've made your argument sound a little bit more convincing. Okay? So the second point I have written over there, which is hearsay, which is something you've heard from someone else, is not considered to be admissible evidence, certainly not in Malta, and certainly not in a lot of jurisdictions around the world. So you either know something because you know it, but you can't know something because your grandma told you, because she heard it from her cousin, who heard it from her aunt. It becomes a question of Chinese telephones at that point and completely unreliable. So the only evidence we hear in court is when someone actually knows something because they've actually experienced it, because they've read it, because they've seen it, because they've heard it, whatever it is. There is also what in Malta we call the rule of best evidence. So you should always present the best evidence that you have in your hands instead of a secondary source. So this means, for instance, if I have a signed receipt, I shouldn't rely on a photo of it. I should actually present that document in court, because that way we have no doubt about what we are talking. But in a world of Photoshop, where I can easily change a number on a photo and from a 0 turn that into a 10 or turn it into a million, okay? The rule of best evidence gives a very secondary value to things that you can't, for which you don't have the best version of. Again, this has application in your debate, because when you can quote a source, or when you can quote an experience that you know is an authentic one that you've either experienced yourself or one which you can actually present evidence of, then again, you're on a bit of a power trip over there. And you can make your arguments more convincing because of this fact. Moving slightly on. It means that when you are in a cross-examination or in an examination in chief, you're typically going to have a time constraint. No judge has enough patience to listen to you all day while you come up with a million questions. You pretty much need to get to the point, and you need to do it quickly and efficiently. So use your question time wisely. Don't waste it asking stupid questions or questions that aren't important. Ask the questions you need to ask, get straight to the point, because they usually have the highest impact on whoever's listening to you. Another trick that as lawyers we depend on is know the answer you want to reach before you ask the question. So if I want to establish where Nick was on Saturday night, it is a bit of a wild card if I'm simply going to ask her, Nick, where were you on Saturday? Ideally, I should already know that she was at home watching Netflix, because that way I can structure my arguments, I can structure my questions in a way that will make sense. If I simply go on a fishing expedition in court and simply ask random questions without having a fairly good idea of what answers I will expect, my arguments are going to be weak. So this is another trick you can pick up from legal debate. No lawyer, no experienced lawyer in court asks a question without knowing the answer. Okay? Lawyers usually know the answers before they've asked the question, so that if you answer incorrectly, you've laid your own trap and you will fall in it. Okay? This is when you start seeing all these TV series and you start seeing lawyers get a little bit vicious. That's when all the traps come out, when suddenly the lawyer gets you into a corner that you weren't predicting would happen. preempt what your opponent will ask and steal their thunder, but be nice about it. There's no need to be a bully about this. Okay, so if you have a fairly good idea of what argument or what sort of questions your opponent is going to come up with, take the opportunity of asking those questions yourself. Why? Because if you own the narrative, if you own the structure of that debate, you own the process of deduction. And whoever owns the process of deduction has the winning argument, if we're going to follow Aristotle's little theory. Okay, so those points I've mentioned over there follow from each other. Have a little bit of foresight into what is going on in your opponent's mind and maximize that potential. Question what is the most likely answer you're going to get and work on that answer, and try and steal a little bit of their thunder by taking a little bit of energy out of their questions. Because suddenly you're going to find an opponent who's, oh shit, someone's taken my questions. Okay, so use that to your advantage. As lawyers, it's a tool, an indispensable tool that we can't live without. How is an argument challenged? An argument is challenged usually in one of two ways. You can either go for direct confrontation on that argument, and when you do that, you're typically going to get into a I'm right, you're wrong kind of debate, which is pretty much going to be a confrontational debate that isn't going to go anywhere. The more confrontational you are, the chances are that the person opposite you is going to be more defensive. So, the way we do this in court is by introducing doubt into our opponent's arguments. Why? Because when you've introduced an element of doubt into that argument, and from a little wedge of doubt, you start turning that into the Grand Canyon of doubt, suddenly that argument falls on its own, without you carrying out a direct attack on the person who's standing opposite you. So there's an advantage to this. You've gotten rid of an aggressive argument, which isn't going to make you look too good, because you're just going to sound like a bully and someone who has no real substance to talk about. Whereas if you do this by introducing doubt to the argument, then again, you could be on a winning streak. So a court can only accept an argument when there is not much doubt left to it. It can only send someone to prison when it is convinced that person has actually done it. If there's such a huge doubt, you know, we can't show whether Giselle, the bank robber, was having an ice cream at the time of the robbery, or whether she was out with her son, or whether she was actually with an axe in her hand beating down the glass of the bank. You know, if we really can't eliminate any of these possibilities, we have too much doubt to be able to send her to prison. So that is actually the way we work in court. We evaluate the amount of doubt in an argument, and we go by that. So you have the second point over there, which is by raising doubt about the strength of an argument or an allegation, you effectively test its reliability. It sounds simple, not that simple, but that's the way it is. Doubt is an argument killer completely. And I'm just going into a little procedural element over here. Certainly in Malta, we have two standards of doubt that we find acceptable in court. So in criminal cases, guilt needs to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. If there is a reasonable doubt that the person may be innocent, the judge has a duty, not simply an option, a duty to acquit that person. Okay? In civil or commercial matters, we don't have such a high standard. In civil or commercial matters, we look at all the events before us and we weigh out which is the more likely version of events. So it's more a question of the majority rules, which argument has the most weight to it, which theory is the most likely. And we would decide things on the basis of likelihood, of probability. Again, this is a standard that is used in a lot of legal systems around the world. It's not unique to Malta. The final stage that we have is the summing up stage. And this is the point when we make final submissions in court. Final submissions don't take up the chunk of a court case, of any court case, is always going to be taken up by the evidence part of the court case. Why? Because you have people who are coming, who need to be summoned. It takes time to question them. So it usually always takes up quite a few sittings until that process is over. In Malta, at least, the final stage of summing up is usually reserved for one hearing before the judge. And what happens in these in the summing up stage is that all the arguments are drawn together. Okay, so I'm on one side of the courtroom and there's another lawyer on the other side. I will draw up all my arguments and make my deductions, and from there draw a demonstration. So, Mr. Judge, I've shown you that this, this, and this has happened, and I've brought evidence that these things have actually really happened, and therefore we can deduce that Nicole was not at home on Saturday night, but she was very likely robbing a bank. And it's from here that you have drawn all the points that in the mind of whoever's listening to you, you've essentially left that person with no real choice but to accept your argument. Why? Because you've made a compelling argument. In Malta, we can make these submissions either in a verbal form or a written form. So you can either put your arguments down in writing. This usually happens when we have a very technical case. So we were arguing about something that's really technical and where we really need to refer to a lot of details. It's often impossible to do it in a verbal form. The court may also allow this to happen in two forms. It may allow the details to be presented in writing, and it can allow a verbal summing up to happen at the second stage. So, are you good to go as legal lawyers? Maybe not, almost. Let's start talking about some of our conclusions that we've talked about over here. And from here, then I'll take this into a debate that we can hold between us over here. So the first point that I want to give you is identify facts that can't be contradicted. Fact is always the strongest point in an argument. This is a water bottle. There's very little way that you can argue that this is a cat, because it is what it is. I've shown it to you and it is a fact. So facts are very, very difficult to contradict. But if I had to come up with the argument of whether this is a nice bottle or an ugly bottle, then we've introduced the element of opinion. Okay, because I may think this is the most beautiful bottle I've ever seen, and someone else could think it's the most hideous bottle you've ever seen. So whereas fact can't really be contradicted, opinion can be. And opinion is where we're never really going to find the conclusion, because we're never going to find one room of people that is going to have the same opinion about the same item in exactly the same way. So wherever you can, in your debate, go for facts, stick to facts, and stick to what you can deduce from those facts. The second point is something that we've already mentioned before, which is the element of preempting. Preempt what your opponent is likely to say. If you're prepared for the likely outcome, then you can counteract it. Whereas if you're not prepared for that outcome, if he's going to take you completely by surprise, you're just going to be standing like a goldfish with your mouth opening and closing and not making much sense. So preempt what your opponent is going to be saying, both before you actually confront the debate and while you are actually carrying out the debate, and work on it from there. You can't do one or the other. It's not a question of you can just go into a debate and just wing it through there. If you are going to be winging it in a debate that matters, like a debate in court, you're going to be transparent about it. It's going to be rather obvious that you haven't really prepared for it. So the best combination is when you've done your homework beforehand, and then you just adapt it during the actual debate itself, during the actual legal argument taking place in court, and just tweak your argument depending on what you've heard a few moments ago. As we mentioned before, introducing doubt is far, far better than directly attacking an opponent. Aggression and personal attacks detract from your argument. They are completely stealing the attention from what should be the focus in the debate. If you're simply going to let yourself come across as a bully and someone who's just there to shout and throw theatrics, the chances are that you're going to exhaust whoever's listening to you and whoever's going to have to decide on the debate. So avoid a headbutt, a headlong confrontation with the person on the other side who's making these sort of arguments, and instead try and introduce doubt into the arguments that are being made. The last point I want to make is that even though you may be arguing with an opponent, don't forget your audience. Especially that audience has decision-making power. So at least one of the things I like doing in court is that when the witness is speaking, my attention isn't 100% on what the witness is actually saying, but probably on what the judge is recording from it. What notes is the judge taking down? At which point is his attention turned on? At which point does he seem to be going to sleep? Because once you've identified what your audience is picking up from that debate, you can have a greater effect on them. You know how your audience is interpreting the debate, and you can maximize that to your advantage. So never forget that a conversation between two opponents is rarely just between those two. There is usually a third or more people who are looking at this. Think of Facebook debates, especially when there's a flame war going on Facebook. It isn't so much about the two people who are actually arguing on that Facebook page. It's about everyone else who's looking at you sometimes. That matters more. I say this a lot to groups I deal with who are activists, you know, and who are trying to promote issues on Facebook or through social media. And it's another of the tips that I give them. Sometimes, yes, you may get a negative reaction. You know, you're trying to create an anti-racism campaign. Sometimes you'll find a lot of racists who'll come and leave a lot of crap. Don't worry, ignore them. The fact is that it's who's watching that's important. If someone's just coming over there and dropping trollish comments, they've shown themselves up for what they are. So it's not simply about that person, it's about who's watching that debate as well.